Hello, dear friends, and Shavua Tov. I am recording this just a few days before Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, in which we commemorate the destruction of the first and the second temple, which will take place this year, Monday night and Tuesday of the coming week, in 2024, of course. I'd like to start off with the book of Zechariah, because these four fasts over Jerusalem in our calendar year, which is the fast of the 10th of Tevet, which is in the winter, which was a siege around Jerusalem. And then you have the 17th of Tammuz, which is when they broke the walls, according to the Talmud in the Second Temple period, the walls of Jerusalem, and the Romans broke the walls. 10th of Tammuz is we have Tevet, when the Babylonian put a siege around Jerusalem in the first temple. The 17th of Tammuz, also the Babylonians broke into Jerusalem, but on the 17th is when it happened in the Second Temple period with the Romans. And the 9th of Av is when both temples were destroyed. According to the prophets, the fire of the temple started on the 7th, the fire in Jerusalem started on the 7th, and the temple was completely destroyed by the 10th of Tevet. And that's why, aside from the fast day of the 9th, we also have a half a day where we continue the laws of mourning, which start on the 9 days prior to, or the 9 days including Tisha B'Av. In addition to this, there's also the fast of Gedaliah, who was in charge of the Jewish community after the destruction of the temple during the time of the Babylonians. And when he was assassinated, this was also declared a fast day. And these are the four fast days over Jerusalem. So in general, they relate to the first temple, but one of them also connects to the second temple period. Now, these fast days already were being fasted during the Babylonian exile after the destruction of the first temple. And this we hear from the book of Zechariah, from Zechariah. And it's actually a very, very interesting 2 chapters about this in Zechariah. I'll try to read with you briefly. In chapter 7 in Zechariah, so it says, this is during the time of Darius the king. And it says it happens in the 9th month, in the month of Kislev. And this is in verse 3. A little hard to see in the the English for some reason. Not clear to me why. When when Beit El Sharetzer and Regamelech and his men had sent to entreat the favor of the Lord and to speak to the priests who were in the house of the Lord, to the prophet, saying, should I weep in the 5th month, separating myself as I have done all these years? In other words, the 5th month, by the way, when you count for the Hebrew month of Nisan, is the month of Av. Basically, the Kohanim were asking whether they still have to 5th on the 9th of Av with the destruction of the temple. Now, remember what we're talking about. This is after Cyrus, Koresh, the king of Persia, allowed the Jews at the end of the Babylonian exile to go back to Jerusalem. He also allowed them to build Jerusalem and the temple. These are Jews who did not yet go. And so the Kohanim want to know, if we're building the temple, when we build this temple, do we still have to fast on the 9th of Av, which commemorates the destruction of the first temple? It's an interesting question, and it's a very valid question. However, Zechariah takes this takes this the wrong way, and possibly for good reasons. And this is verse 4. And the word of the Lord of hosts came to me, saying, speak to all these people of the land and to the priests, and say to them, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th month, meaning on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, And in the 7th month, fast of Gedaliah, for these last 70 years of the exile, was it for me that you fasted? And when you eat and when you drink, do you eat for yourselves? Do you not eat for yourselves and drink for yourselves? Should you not hear the words of God which he proclaimed by the former prophets when Jerusalem was inhabited and in prosperity? In other words, that's what you're worried about, fasting? You think you fast for me? Just like you don't eat for me, you don't fast for me. I don't take it so seriously. In other words, don't think you're so great that you fast, which is interesting. So basically, he's reproving the people. You're not that saintly to ask questions like this. Then the next verse says, and then the Lord of the host spoke again to Zechariah and saying, tell the people, execute true judgment, show love, mercy, every man to his brother. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless or the stranger or the poor. Let none of you devise evil against his brother in your heart. But you refuse to hearken and turned a stubborn shoulder and dropped their ears that they should not hear. They made their hearts an adamant stone, lest they should hear the words of the Torah and the words of God, which is sent in the spirit of the former prophets, etc. And that's why the destruction came in the first place. And then verse 4 of the next chapter, but this is what the Lord of hosts says. Old men and old women shall again dwell in the streets of Jerusalem, every man with his staff in his hand, and for every age. And the streets of the city shall be full of children playing in its streets. Thus says God, it will be marvelous in the eyes of the remnant of these people in these days. And it will be marvelous even in my eyes, says the Lord of hosts. Because I will save you, my people, from the east country and from the west country. And I will bring you into the midst of Jerusalem. And they will be my people, and I will be their God in truth and in righteousness. And then I'm going to get back to exactly the thing that involves us here. And then the word of the Lord of hosts came to me, saying, this is what God says. The fast of the fourth month, meaning the 17th of Tammuz, which commemorates the breaking of the walls of Jerusalem in the second temple, and the fast of the 5th, Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the 2 temples, and the fast of the 7th, the fast of Gedaliah, the fast of the 10th, which talks about the siege of Jerusalem. All these days shall become times of joy and gladness, and cheerful feasts to the house of Judah. Therefore, love truth and love peace. So basically, the prophet's answer is, you're right. The fast days will be abolished. It will be a time of joy and happiness and festivities when the temple is rebuilt. Now, first of all, this is very interesting in multiple ways. Number one, we don't have a lot of places in the written Bible, the 24 books of the Masoretic text of the Jewish Bible, in which you have rabbinic decrees mentioned as public days. Fast days, of course, are rabbinic decrees. I'm not talking about Yom Kippur, which is in the Torah, the Day of Atonement. But these fast days are commemorating the destruction of the first and then later the second temple. But this, of course, at this time is the first. And it looks like they're already keeping these fast days. And we know this from the book of Zechariah. And they're asking if these fast days are temporary, when the second temple will be rebuilt, do we have to keep them? That's interesting. So just by itself is interesting. You have a rabbinic enactment mentioned in the written Bible. Aside from there's another one, of course, in the Scroll of Esther. Also, Purim itself is a rabbinic enactment mentioned in the Bible. But then Zechariah's answer is also very interesting, because Zechariah says basically that these fast days are not permanent. They are temporary measures as atonement for the destruction of the temple. When the temple's rebuilt, that's it. Then they become days of jubilation anymore. The Beit Yosef, Joseph Caro on the tour, when he talks about this verse, and he says they will be days of jubilation and joy, he says that means you're not allowed to fast on those days anymore when it becomes such, and not even eulogize on those days for a deceased person. So how does that affect the halacha? Interestingly enough, in the Talmud, there is a discussion about this. The Talmud basically says in his discussion that theoretically, if Jews are living in a time of peace, even if Jerusalem was not built, the people can decide if they want to keep the fast days. However, only 3 out of the 4 they can decide, not Tisha B'Av, because many things happen on Tisha B'Av. But the other 3, Sar B'Tevet, 17th of Tammuz, some Gedalia, if they feel they're in peaceful times, even if they're outside the land of Israel, it's a voluntary decision among the people, whether as a group, of course, not as individuals, if they want to keep it or not. And of course, Jews decided to keep it. But when does it become an obligation not to fast? At what point? This discussion does not take place in the Shulchan Aruch, it takes place in the Tur. The Tur, which is a forerunner of the Code of Jewish Law, written by Yaakov Turim, Yaakov ben Asher Turim, in Spain actually, predates the Shulchan Aruch. And and it also has very important commentaries of the authors of the Shulchan Aruch. The Beit Yosef, which is written by Joseph Caro, the Sephardic author of the Shulchan Aruch, and Darkei Moshe, written by Moshe Isserlich, the Ashkenazic author of the Shulchan Aruch, and in addition, the Beit Chadash, which is written by Yoel Sirkis from Krakow, of Yoel Sirkis. Now, interestingly enough, on this discussion, the question is, at what point are these fast days basically deleted? When do they stop? Beit Yosef, Joseph Caro says, as long as the nations are controlling Israel, fast days keep it going. Which means as soon as there is a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, so we don't have to keep the fast days anymore. Now, this is interesting because today there is a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, so theoretically you shouldn't keep the fast days. At least 3 of them, based on what the Talmud said according to the interpretation of Joseph Caro, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Interestingly enough, he doesn't say this in the Shulchan Aruch, but he does say it on the Tur. The Bach, Rav Yoel Sirkis, says a little bit differently. He says when the temple is built, that's when all 4 of them will be gone, because it doesn't make sense to build the temple and to still fast on Tisha B'Av over the destruction of the temple when you rebuild it. So I understand from what he's saying, when the temple is built, all 4, of course, fast days will be days of jubilation. And it'll be a time to celebrate the new temple. And of course, based on this, even if you have a Jewish sovereignty, we're still not there yet, which is probably the position which is taken in the state of Israel today. I'd like to add to that, but number one, it's important to understand these are temporary measures, these fast days, which means we're supposed to move forward. And the goal is to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple as a spiritual center for the Jewish people and all mankind, which will mark a change in humanity. Because we're going through difficult times. And these difficult times are instability of the human situation on this planet. When evil is abundant, it creates instability. When people turn their hearts to their brothers and their sisters in justice and righteousness, it creates stability in the world. And then evil is on the defensive instead of on the offensive. I'd like to add, though, another point. We have 2 sets of days in the Hebrew calendar, in the Jewish calendar. 2 sets of days of 22 days. The first one is at the beginning of the calendar at Tishrei, where we have 22 days of festivities. Some of them are days of introspection, but in general, they're all called holidays. 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, right at the beginning of Tishrei, leads into what we call the days of penitence. Then on the 10th of those days, we have Yom Kippur, the fast, which is not a time of mourning, it's a time of taking stock, a time of confession, time of prayer, a time of change, a time of teshuvah. And then after that, we have days of joy, Zman Simchatenu, the Sukkot festival. On the Sukkot festival, we build a house, a hut, and that hut is called, in the book of Amos, chapter 9, Sukkot David Hanofelet, the falling sukkah of David, which of course hints to the temple. So we're building a house in the end, a house where we have to see also the stars through the covering, through the leaf covering of this hut, which represents a relationship between man and God, which is what the temple is all about. So these are Zman Simchatenu, times of joy, and they're 22 days. But there's another 22 days, which are these 3 weeks. From the 17th day of Tammuz until the 9th of Av is called the 3 weeks, 3 weeks of mourning. And these 3 weeks are exactly 22 days, including Shiva Asar Tammuz and the 9th of Av. Now, 22 in our tradition is the letters of the alphabet. Letters of the alphabet in the book of formation, the book of Yitzirah, are called building blocks. When you want to build, you need these letters. In the Kabbalistic tradition, when the letters are spelled forwards, meaning Aleph, Beit, Gimel, like ABC going forwards, that's called building. When the letters are stated backwards, going from the end to the beginning, Taf, Shin, Reish, Kuf, going all the way back to the Aleph, that's called Midat Hadin, which means stern judgment or destroying. So that would explain that at the beginning of the year, these are building blocks. And at the end of the 20, and in the last days of the 22, we're involved in sitting in a house that we built. And this house represents the temple to the Jewish people. Whereas in the 3 weeks of mourning from the 17th of Tammuz until Tisha B'Av, the letters are going backwards. And they're going backwards, and that's why they end up with the house being destroyed, which is the temple. It was destroyed both the first time and the second time. There might even be a bit of a hint in the structure, because you have the 10 days of penitence, and then 12 days after in the building. 10 days of penitence, then days of joy, which culminate with the end of the Sukkot Shmini Atzeret festival in which we build a house. Also, here you have sort of the opposite. First you have 13 days actually, and then you have 9 days, which are sort of a 10th day because there actually is, the morning goes into the day of the 10th, but it's almost the backwards structure. That's my point. Almost the backwards structure, which sort of suggests also that it's going backwards. Where do we find that positive things happen when the Aleph Beit goes forwards? Well, for instance, in the book of Psalms, you have the Psalm Tilala David, the Psalm of David, where it's all of the alphabet, from Aleph to Taf, and we have a tradition to recite that 3 times a day. There's also Psalm Kuf 119, which also has the alphabet 7 times, going in the correct order. In the Musaf service on the Sabbath, where we bring an offering in the temple, and offerings do involve taking the life of an animal, there the Aleph Beit in the Musaf service goes backwards. It goes Tikanta, Shabbat, Ratzita, Korbanotzeha, Tzivita, Perushea, Im Sidurei Nesacheha, talking about the offerings, and it goes from the top, from the end of the alphabet, all the way back to the beginning of the Hebrew alphabet, which represents, as I said, stern judgment, and because there's a taking of life there, which is the offering. Even if it's a mitzvah to bring the offerings in the temple. So we have these 2 days. The days of mourning were the days of jubilation. We're building the house. The days of mourning where the house is taken away. But the days of mourning are temporary measure. And the goal is to rebuild. Because when God takes away, God gives the power for us to bring back. And he wants to see us do it. And he wants to see us merit it and be worthy of it. So when we rebuild Israel, when we rebuild Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple for us and the whole world, it will be a time in which we will have a renewed strength of unity, love, and peace. As the prophet Zechariah says, "Va'emet v'hashalom ehavu," that after these days are turned into jubilation, you have to learn to love truth and peace. Shalom, shalom.